Sarah Martinez had been looking forward to this evening for weeks. After working 12-hour shifts at the hospital for 6 straight days, she finally had a night off. She chose Antonio's, a cozy Italian restaurant downtown that she had heard wonderful things about from her colleagues. The warm lighting and soft jazz music created exactly the peaceful atmosphere she needed. She sat alone at a small table by the window, watching people walk by on the busy street outside. Sarah had always enjoyed dining alone. It gave her time to think, to read, and to simply exist without the constant demands of her job as a nurse. Tonight, she brought along a book she had been trying to finish for months. The restaurant was moderately busy for a Thursday evening. Families occupied the larger tables. Couples shared intimate conversations over wine, and business associates discussed their latest projects. Sarah ordered the seafood pasta and a glass of white wine, settling into her comfortable solitude. At a table across the room sat 3 men in their 30s. They wore expensive suits and had been drinking heavily since they arrived an hour ago. Mark, the loudest of the group, worked in sales for a tech company. His friends Jake and Tony were equally successful in their respective fields, finance and real estate. They considered themselves the epitome of success, often bragging about their conquests both in business and with women. Mark noticed Sarah almost immediately when she walked in. She was attractive with long, dark hair and an elegant way of carrying herself. But what caught his attention most was that she was alone. To Mark, a woman dining alone was either desperate for attention or playing hard to get. Either way, he saw it as an opportunity. "Check out the brunette by the window," Mark said to his friends, nodding in Sarah's direction. "She's been sitting there for 20 minutes without anyone joining her, probably waiting for some guy who stood her up." Jake looked over and grinned. "Poor thing. Maybe we should go keep her company." Tony laughed. "Yeah, save her from eating alone like some kind of loser." The 3 men had been friends since college, where they were known for their aggressive pursuit of women at parties. They called it hunting, and they prided themselves on their supposed success rate. Age and professional success had not matured their attitudes toward women. Sarah was completely unaware of their attention. She had just received her pasta and was enjoying the first few bites while reading her book. The wine was perfect, the food was delicious, and she felt truly relaxed for the first time in days. She thought about her patients at the hospital, particularly Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had been struggling with her recovery but had finally turned a corner that week. Mark stood up first, straightening his tie with confidence. "Gentlemen, let's go introduce ourselves. She looks lonely." The 3 men approached Sarah's table with the swagger of men who believed they were doing her a favor. Mark led the way, flashing what he thought was his most charming smile. "Excuse me, miss," Mark said, stopping directly beside her table. "We couldn't help but notice you're dining alone. That's such a shame for a beautiful woman like yourself." Sarah looked up from her book, immediately sensing something unsettling about these men. Their smiles seemed predatory, and they stood too close to her table. She had dealt with unwanted attention before, especially during her college years, and had learned to trust her instincts. "Thank you, but I prefer eating alone," Sarah said politely but firmly, hoping they would take the hint and leave her in peace. Jake stepped forward, pulling out the chair across from her without invitation. "Come on, don't be shy. We're successful businessmen. We could show you a really good time." "I appreciate the offer, but I'm enjoying my quiet evening," Sarah replied, her voice remaining calm despite her growing discomfort. She closed her book and placed it on the table, a subtle signal that she was prepared to leave if necessary. Tony moved to her other side, effectively boxing her in. "Look, sweetheart, we're just trying to be friendly. No need to be rude about it." The restaurant's other patrons began to notice the situation. A young couple at a nearby table exchanged concerned glances. An older man dining with his wife looked over with a frown. The server, Maria, who had been working at Antonio's for 5 years, watched from behind the bar with growing concern. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. These men were not taking no for an answer, and their body language was becoming increasingly aggressive. She had seen this behavior before, both personally and professionally. As a nurse, she had treated women who had been victims of harassment and assault. She knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. "Gentlemen, I've asked you politely to leave me alone. I'm asking again. Please return to your table," Sarah said, her voice louder and firmer than before. Mark laughed, a sound that carried no warmth. "Oh, so now you think you're too good for us? Listen, lady, we're offering to buy you drinks and dinner. Most women would be grateful." "Most women know quality when they see it," Jake added, his voice dripping with false charm and real menace. Sarah reached for her purse, planning to pay her bill and leave immediately. She had lost her appetite, and the peaceful evening she had planned was ruined. But as she moved to stand, Tony placed his hand on her shoulder, pushing her gently but firmly back into her seat. "Where do you think you're going?" "We're not finished talking to you yet," Tony said, his grip tightening slightly. The physical contact crossed a line that Sarah would not tolerate. She was no longer just uncomfortable. She was angry. As a healthcare worker, she had dealt with difficult patients and aggressive family members. She had learned to stand her ground when necessary. "Take your hand off me right now," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the restaurant's ambient noise. Other diners were now openly staring. The older man stood up from his table, as if preparing to intervene. Maria, the server, had stopped what she was doing and was reaching for the phone behind the bar. But the 3 men were too drunk and too arrogant to read the room. They saw Sarah's resistance as a challenge rather than a warning. They had gotten away with this behavior before, usually because their targets were too intimidated to fight back, or because bystanders chose not to get involved. Mark leaned down closer to Sarah, his breath reeking of alcohol. "You know what I think? I think you came here hoping to meet someone like us. Playing hard to get is cute, but it's time to drop the act." Sarah's training kicked in. She had taken self-defense classes in nursing school, and she had learned to project confidence even when she felt threatened. She looked Mark directly in the eyes, her voice steady and clear. "I'm going to count to 3. If you and your friends haven't returned to your table by then, I'm calling the police." 1. Jake laughed. "Ooh, she's counting. I'm so scared." 2. Tony tightened his grip on her shoulder. "Nobody's calling anybody. You're going to sit here and have a drink with us like a civilized person." Sarah reached the count of 3, but before she could say the word or reach for her phone, something happened that none of them expected. The restaurant's front door opened, and a man in a crisp police uniform walked in. But this wasn't just any police officer. This was Captain Rodriguez, Sarah's older brother. Captain Rodriguez had stopped by Antonio's on his way home from the police station. After a long day dealing with budget meetings and administrative paperwork, he wanted to grab some takeout for dinner. He had heard great things about their chicken parmesan and decided to try it for himself. As he stepped through the front door, his trained eyes immediately scanned the restaurant out of habit. 23 years on the force had taught him to assess any room he entered for potential problems. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 men were surrounding a woman at a table by the window. One had his hand on her shoulder, while the other 2 leaned in aggressively. The woman's body language screamed distress. Her shoulders were tense, she was gripping her purse, and she was clearly trying to get away from them. Other diners were watching with obvious concern, but no one had yet intervened. It took Captain Rodriguez exactly 2 seconds to realize the woman being harassed was his younger sister, Sarah. The protective instincts that had made him an excellent police officer for over 2 decades kicked into overdrive. But these were the same instincts that had driven him to become a police officer in the first place. He had always felt compelled to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The fact that the victim was his sister simply amplified what was already a fundamental part of his character. Rodriguez moved across the restaurant with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command. His 6'3" frame and authoritative presence caused conversations to pause as he passed. The three men were so focused on intimidating Sarah that they didn't notice his approach until he was standing directly behind Mark. "Is there a problem here?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of authority that comes from years of dealing with criminals and troublemakers. Mark turned around, annoyed at the interruption. He saw a man in a police uniform, and his first instinct was to try to charm his way out of whatever trouble he might be in. Mark was the type of person who believed his success in business meant he could talk his way out of any situation. "No problem at all, officer," Mark said with false friendliness. "Just having a friendly conversation with this lovely lady." Rodriguez looked at his sister, whose eyes were filled with relief at seeing him. He could see the stress in her face, the way she was holding herself defensively. He had seen that same expression on countless victims during his career, but seeing it on Sarah's face triggered something primal in him. "Ma'am, is this man bothering you?" Rodriguez asked Sarah directly, following proper police protocol even though he already knew the answer. "Yes," Sarah said immediately. "I asked them multiple times to leave me alone, but they won't. This one," she gestured to Tony, "physically prevented me from leaving my seat." Rodriguez felt his jaw tighten. Physical restraint elevated this from simple harassment to assault. He looked at Tony's hand, which was still resting on Sarah's shoulder, and his voice dropped to a dangerously quiet level. "Take your hand off the lady. Now." Tony, emboldened by alcohol and the presence of his friends, made the worst decision of his evening. Instead of immediately complying, he looked Rodriguez up and down dismissively. "Look, cop, this is none of your business. We're just talking to her. Last I checked, conversation wasn't illegal." Jake, slightly more sober than his friends, sensed danger and tugged at Tony's sleeve. "Maybe we should just go back to our table, man." But Tony was too drunk and too arrogant to listen. "No, I'm tired of people thinking they can tell us what to do. We didn't do anything wrong." Rodriguez had dealt with men like this countless times throughout his career. They were bullies who preyed on people they perceived as weaker, but who crumbled the moment they faced real consequences for their actions. The key was to demonstrate that those consequences were both immediate and unavoidable. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to remove your hand from this woman's shoulder. If you refuse, you will be arrested for assault." Mark stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We were just being friendly. Maybe we came on a little strong, but we didn't mean any harm." Rodriguez turned his attention to Mark, his expression stern. "The lady asked you to leave her alone. She asked you multiple times. When someone says no, it means no. When someone tells you to leave them alone, you leave them alone. This isn't complicated." The restaurant had gone completely silent. Every customer and staff member was watching the confrontation unfold. Maria, the server, had moved closer with her phone ready to call for backup if needed, though she realized backup had already arrived. Jake finally managed to convince Tony to remove his hand from Sarah's shoulder. "Come on, Tony, let's just go. This isn't worth it." But the damage was already done. Rodriguez had witnessed assault, harassment, and intimidation. He had also observed their disrespectful attitude when confronted by police authority. As a police captain, he had a duty to respond appropriately. "Actually, gentlemen, you're not going anywhere just yet. I need to see some identification." Mark's confidence finally began to waver. "Is that really necessary? We said we'd leave." "Yes, it's necessary. You've committed several crimes this evening, and I'm conducting an investigation." The three men reluctantly produced their driver's licenses. Rodriguez examined each one carefully, memorizing their names and addresses. He also noted that all three showed signs of intoxication: bloodshot eyes, the smell of alcohol, and unsteady movement. Sarah finally stood up from her table, moving to a safe distance from the three men. She was shaking slightly, a combination of anger and adrenaline coursing through her system. She had dealt with difficult people in her job as a nurse, but this was different. This was personal harassment that had made her feel vulnerable and powerless. Rodriguez handed the IDs back and pulled out his notebook. Mark Henderson, Jake Murphy, and Tony Castellano, you are all under arrest for harassment, disorderly conduct, and assault. Mr. Castellano, you are additionally charged with unlawful restraint. The transformation in the three men was immediate and dramatic. The swagger and confidence disappeared, replaced by shock and panic. They had started the evening feeling invincible, drunk on alcohol and their own perceived importance. Now they faced criminal charges and the realization that their actions had serious consequences. "Wait, you can't be serious," Mark protested. "We didn't hurt anybody. We were just talking to her." Rodriguez began reading them their rights, his voice professional and unwavering. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Tony interrupted desperately. "This is ridiculous. We're successful businessmen. We don't belong in jail. Can't we just apologize and forget this whole thing happened?" "You had the chance to apologize and walk away when the lady first asked you to leave her alone," Rodriguez replied. "You chose instead to escalate the situation. You chose to ignore her clearly stated boundaries. You chose to physically restrain her when she tried to leave. These were your choices, and now you face the consequences of those choices." Jake, who had been relatively quiet, finally spoke up. "Officer, please. We've learned our lesson. We'll never do anything like this again. Isn't there something we can work out?" Rodriguez finished reading them their rights and looked at each man in turn. "Here's what we're going to work out. You're going to be arrested and taken to the station for processing. You'll be photographed and fingerprinted. You'll spend the night in jail. Tomorrow you'll appear before a judge who will decide your fate." The reality of their situation was finally sinking in. These men, who had felt so powerful and entitled just minutes before, now faced public humiliation, legal consequences, and the destruction of their reputations. Other officers arrived within minutes to assist with the arrests. Rodriguez had called for backup while questioning the suspects, following standard procedure. The three men were handcuffed and led out of the restaurant while other diners watched in satisfied silence. Sarah remained at the restaurant to give her official statement to one of the responding officers. As she recounted the events of the evening, she felt a mixture of emotions: relief that it was over, gratitude for her brother's timely arrival, but also anger that such an incident had been necessary in the first place. The police station was buzzing with activity when the three men were brought in for processing. The desk sergeant, Officer Williams, had been working the night shift for 15 years and had seen every type of criminal imaginable. When Captain Rodriguez personally brought in three suspects for harassment and assault, Williams knew this was no ordinary arrest. Mark, Jake, and Tony sat in separate holding cells, each facing the stark reality of their situation. The fluorescent lights were harsh, the benches were uncomfortable, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with fear filled the air. This was a far cry from the upscale restaurants and bars where they usually spent their evenings. Mark stared at the concrete wall, his mind racing. He thought about his job at the tech company, his expensive apartment, his carefully cultivated image as a successful businessman. All of that seemed meaningless now. He had never been arrested before, never even gotten a serious speeding ticket. The thought of his colleagues finding out made him sick to his stomach. In the next cell, Jake was having similar thoughts. He worked for a prestigious financial firm that conducted thorough background checks on all employees. A criminal conviction could end his career instantly. His hands were shaking as he contemplated calling his lawyer, his parents, his girlfriend who thought he was working late at the office. Tony was perhaps the most devastated of the three. As a real estate agent, his livelihood depended entirely on his reputation and trustworthiness. Who would want to buy a house from someone who had been convicted of harassing women? His mind kept replaying the events at the restaurant, wishing desperately that he could take it all back. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in Captain Rodriguez's office, finishing her written statement. She had calmed down considerably since leaving the restaurant, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. This wasn't just about what had happened to her personally. It was about every woman who had been in similar situations without someone to help them. "How often does this kind of thing happen?" Sarah asked her brother as she signed her statement. Rodriguez sighed heavily. "More often than you'd think. Usually we only hear about it when it escalates to physical assault or when someone actually calls for help. Most of the time, women just endure it and hope the men will eventually get bored and leave them alone." Sarah nodded grimly. She thought about her female colleagues at the hospital, the stories they shared about unwanted attention from patients, visitors, and even some doctors. Society had taught women to be polite, to not make scenes, to give men the benefit of the doubt even when their behavior was clearly inappropriate. "What happens to them now?" she asked. "They'll be arraigned tomorrow morning. Given their lack of prior records, they'll probably be released on their own recognizance. But they'll have court dates scheduled. The charges are serious enough that they could face fines, community service, maybe even some jail time depending on the judge." Rodriguez paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sarah, I want you to know that even if I hadn't been your brother, I would have intervened. What those men did was wrong, and it's exactly the kind of behavior that police officers are trained to address." Sarah smiled at her brother. "I know, and I'm grateful you happened to be there, but it makes me think about all the times when there isn't a police captain around to help." The next morning, Mark, Jake, Ma, and Tony appeared before Judge Patricia Harrison for their arraignment. Judge Harrison was known for her no-nonsense approach to criminal justice and her particular sensitivity to crimes involving the harassment or intimidation of women. The three men stood before the bench wearing the same clothes from the night before, now wrinkled and stained. Their expensive suits, which had once made them feel powerful and important, now seemed like costumes from another life. Each had managed to contact a lawyer, though none of their attorneys seemed particularly optimistic about their cases. Judge Harrison reviewed the police report and witness statements. "Gentlemen, you are charged with harassment, disorderly conduct, and assault. Mr. Castellano, you face an additional charge of unlawful restraint. How do you plead?" One by one, they entered pleas of not guilty on the advice of their lawyers. But as Judge Harrison explained the potential consequences they faced, the gravity of their situation became clear. Mark could face up to 1 year in jail and a $1,000 fine. Jake faced similar penalties. Tony, with the additional charge, could face up to 2 years in prison and $2,000 in fines. "I'm releasing you on your own recognizance," Judge Harrison announced, "but with conditions. You are prohibited from contacting the victim or visiting the restaurant where this incident occurred. You are also required to attend counseling sessions on appropriate social behavior and respect for others. Failure to comply with these conditions will result in immediate imprisonment." As they left the courthouse, the three men faced a reality they had never considered. Their names were now part of the public record. Local media had picked up the story. 3 businessmen arrested for harassing woman at restaurant, and it was spreading on social media. In the age of the internet, their mugshots and names would be permanently associated with their crimes. Mark was the first to face professional consequences. His boss called him into the office that afternoon, having seen the news coverage. The company prided itself on treating all employees and customers with respect. and Mark's behavior was completely contrary to their values. He was suspended pending an internal investigation, and his colleagues looked at him with disgust and disappointment. Jake's situation was even worse. His financial firm had a strict moral turpitude clause in all employee contracts. Any behavior that reflected poorly on the company was grounds for immediate termination. By the end of the week, he had been fired, and his professional reputation was in ruins. Tony discovered that several of his real estate clients had already called to terminate their contracts with him. His broker was considering removing him from the agency entirely. In an industry built on trust and relationships, his actions had destroyed the foundation of his career, but the consequences extended beyond their professional lives. Mark's girlfriend broke up with him after seeing the news coverage and realizing what kind of person she had been dating. Jake's parents were horrified and ashamed of their son's behavior. Tony's sister, a victim of harassment herself years earlier, refused to speak to him. The counseling sessions proved to be particularly difficult for all three men. The counselor, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, specialized in helping people understand the impact of their actions on others. She forced them to confront the reality that their behavior had been not just illegal, but deeply harmful. "You need to understand," Dr. Walsh explained during one session, "that what you did to that woman affected more than just her evening. You made her feel unsafe, powerless, and violated. You turned what should have been a peaceful, enjoyable experience into a traumatic memory." Mark tried to justify their actions. "We were just trying to be friendly. We didn't mean any harm." "Intent doesn't matter," Dr. Walsh replied firmly. "Impact matters. The woman you harassed told you multiple times to leave her alone. She made it clear that your attention was unwelcome. Yet you persisted, you escalated, and you physically restrained her. That's not being friendly, that's being aggressive and threatening." Over the course of several weeks, the three men began to understand the broader implications of their behavior. They learned about the epidemic of harassment that women face daily, the way such encounters make women feel unsafe in public spaces, and the long-term psychological effects of being intimidated and threatened. Jake was the first to experience what might be called genuine remorse. "I keep thinking about my sister," he admitted during one session. "She's told me stories about men bothering her at bars and restaurants. I always thought she was overreacting. Now I realize those men were probably just like us." Sarah, meanwhile, had returned to her normal life, but with a new perspective on the incident. She had received several messages from other women who had read about the case in the news. Many shared their own stories of harassment, thanking her for pressing charges and seeing the case through to its conclusion. One message particularly touched her. It was from a young college student who wrote, "Thank you for not backing down. I was harassed at a restaurant last year and I was too scared to report it. Seeing that these men faced real consequences gives me hope that things might actually change." The court case concluded 3 months after the incident. All three men pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for community service, substantial fines, and continued counseling. They would also have criminal records that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Mark was required to perform 200 hours of community service at a women's shelter. Jake was assigned to work with a nonprofit organization that supported victims of harassment and assault. Tony was ordered to speak at college campuses about the consequences of inappropriate behavior toward women. During his community service at the women's shelter, Mark met women who had experienced far worse treatment than what he had subjected Sarah to. He heard stories of domestic violence, stalking, and sexual assault. He began to understand that his behavior was part of a continuum of male aggression toward women. "I used to think what we did wasn't that serious," Mark confided to his counselor months later. "We didn't hit her or physically hurt her. But now I realize that harassment and intimidation are forms of violence too. We made her feel afraid and powerless, and that's inexcusable." The incident became a turning point for all three men, though in different ways. Mark eventually found a new job at a smaller company, but only after completing extensive sensitivity training and demonstrating genuine change. He began volunteering regularly at the women's shelter even after his community service ended. Jake moved back to his hometown and started working for his father's small business. The experience had humbled him completely, and he became an advocate for respectful workplace policies. He often spoke about his experience to other young professionals, warning them about the serious consequences of inappropriate behavior. Tony struggled the most with rebuilding his life. His real estate career was effectively over, and he had to find work in an entirely different field. But he also became one of Dr. Walsh's most dedicated students, eventually training to become a counselor himself, so he could help other men who struggled with respecting boundaries and treating women appropriately. For Sarah, the incident had a profound impact on her perspective on gender relations and personal safety. She began volunteering with organizations that taught self-defense to women and advocated for better harassment policies in workplaces and public spaces. "That night taught me that we can't rely on random chance to protect us," Sarah explained to a group of nurses during a workplace safety seminar she organized at the hospital. "I was lucky that my brother happened to walk into that restaurant." But we shouldn't have to rely on luck. We need to create a society where women can exist in public spaces without fear of harassment or intimidation. The case also had broader implications. Antonio's restaurant implemented new staff training on how to recognize and respond to harassment. Several other local establishments followed suit, creating policies to protect customers from unwanted attention and aggressive behavior. Captain Rodriguez used the incident as a teaching moment for the officers under his command. "This case shows why we need to take harassment seriously," he told his department during a training session. "These men thought they could intimidate a woman without consequences. They learned otherwise, and hopefully, their experience will deter others from similar behavior." The story of what happened that night spread far beyond the local community. It became a case study in criminal justice classes, a cautionary tale in business ethics seminars, and an example of how quickly privilege and success can disappear when someone chooses to abuse their power over others. Years later, all three men would look back on that evening as the worst and most important night of their lives. It cost them their careers, their reputations, and their sense of invincibility. But it also forced them to become better people, to understand the impact of their actions on others, and to use their experience to prevent similar incidents from occurring. Sarah continued to dine alone at restaurants, but now she did so with the confidence that comes from knowing she had stood up for herself and others. She never forgot the lesson of that evening, that silence in the face of inappropriate behavior only enables it to continue, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is say no and mean it.